So why the heck are WPS such a big deal? So for the new guys, here's why everyone loses their minds over WPS compliance. So it all starts with about, let's call it 110, 120 years ago. They had a lot of boiler explosions. So the American Society of Mechanical Engineers gets together and they put together the rules for the construction of steam boilers and pressure vessels because they didn't like things like this happening on a regular basis. If you ever take my online class from the American Welding Society, I got a slide that shows the number of boiler explosions in like 1911, and it was huge. There was a spike. Then they made rules, and then it tapered off. And nowadays we still have them, but it's not nearly as catastrophic as this. All right, it all starts with a contract. So before a single arc is struck, the paperwork war begins. And there's a contract between whoever's wants something built and whoever they're going to get to build it. So there's tenders and there's contracts, and they go back and forth on this. I don't know a lot about it, but I know it exists. And you go back and forth until there's an agreement made, and then they sign a contract. So when they do that, the welding engineers go through the specs, the codes, all the materials, and what we do is we find anything in there that's going to be nasty or weld critical applications where there's no room for error. And this might just be finding out how nasty the WPS and the PQRs are going to be to qualify, or how nasty this stuff is going to be to weld. So we figure out the welding plan before anybody ever touches a rod. What metals are getting welded together, what filler materials, dissimilar weld joints, thicknesses, qualifications we're going to need. Do we have a WPS to weld this? What do we got to do? So, as I've said before, if we're not just making barbecue pits in Tulsa, if this stuff's going on the bottom of the ocean or some other critical application, we got to take this seriously. So, qualifying a weld procedure. This is where the real work starts. So, before you get a WPS, somebody has to prove that this thing works, that we can weld metal A to metal B using this process and not completely lose our tails on this thing, and we come out of it ahead, make money. So we qualify the procedures, meaning we physically weld it, test it, and document it. We do a PQR, we weld up a test coupon, and then we use the PQR to support the WPS. And then we submit it to the owner and the third-party inspectors to take a look at. And the odds are they're going to tear it apart 37 times, and we're going to have to rewrite it, and then maybe they approve it after they've torn through it. Sometimes I've been this guy, sometimes I'm the approver. And only then does it hit the shop floor for production. And by the time it gets to the welder, this thing has been to hell and back twice. So here's a little slide that shows kind of the general flow chart for WPS and PQR development. So we're going to procure materials and destructive testing, figure out the base materials, filler metal, shielding gas, what NDE is needed. And then we're going to look at the welding code. What code are we welding this to? Is it ASME? Is it structural? Is it structural stainless? What do we got going? Here's another little flow chart we got. Okay, so you're going to ask for joining procedure. We're going to do a preliminary WPS. We're going to weld the test coupon. We're going to record the essential variables while we're welding that test coupon. We're going to write the PQR. Then we're going to write the WPS. And then we're going to submit to the client for approval. And this is where the rock fight starts. So this is what a test coupon looks like. I think this one would probably be more for a welder or a performance qualification, but you get the idea. So anytime we're going to qualify a procedure, plate, pipe, tubing, whatever, we're going to have to do a procedure qualification record. And we're going to weld it up with whatever we're using, and we're going to have to submit it to the lab for testing, and then we're going to have to write a procedure qualification record on it. We're going to use that to support the WPS. So you're probably asking yourself, why are the WPSs so strict? What's the deal? Why are these guys so crazy about this? Well, if we're not welding boat trailers, we're welding critical components that can't fail. Critical components. Somebody could die if this thing fails. Multiple people could die. Could cause tens of millions of dollars worth of damage if it fails. So we're not, building barbecue pits. Not that you don't want to have some kind of, standards and really do a good job building a good quality barbecue pit when you're working for Fred's Barbecue out of Tulsa. But you're not getting the big kid money as a welder because they like you. They're giving you big kid money because failure is not an option. They expect you to put sound weld metal into that weld joint, and it's not going to come apart tomorrow, 5 years from now, or 10 years from now. One wrong move, you mess up a weld, depending on what it is, and the company is on the hook for millions in liability, possibly, depending on what's going on and what fails or could possibly fail. And if it does go wrong, companies lawyer up, and then the lawsuits happen, and everybody in your company is running for cover. There are law firms that do nothing but represent companies either suing another company, trying to claw back money because the project went bad, or companies that are lawyers that defend against companies suing their client, trying to get money back because something went sideways. This is why WPSs are not a guideline. They're rules of law on that job site. That's why we follow them to the letter of the law. So what happens when you go rogue? Let's say you don't follow the WPS. Here's what happens next. You grab the wrong filler metal. Maybe you're handed the wrong filler metal. Maybe they give you 316 instead of 321 stainless. Maybe that's how it goes down. And it makes it into production. Nobody catches it. Then it comes to an audit or somebody figures it out, and here comes the inspector. Congrats. We've just got a compliance nightmare on our hands. And usually it's the third-party inspector. These guys don't work for the company we're working for. They usually work for the owner. They're there to make sure that the owner gets what he is paid for. They are there to make sure that if it says that anchovy pizza is to have 21 anchovies on that pizza, he makes sure it's not 27. He makes sure it's 21. Exactly what is in that contract. They are there to protect the client's investment. They're not there to make our lives easier or be our buddies. They are there to work for the client, the company that's going to own whatever it is we're building, and make sure that we build it right. If they catch us messing up, it could stop the entire job. Well, we go into damage control. This could very well happen. Shut down all welding activities. Done. You guys don't have a clue as to what you're doing. We're just going to shut it down until you guys bring in some grown-ups and figure this out. And guess who has to explain why we didn't follow the WPS? Yep, we end up in the nightmare scenario. Now we're in meetings. And you thought, hey, man, we're just welding. Nope. Now we're in the paperwork trenches in some kind of knife fight, metaphorical knife fight, right? These things can get brutal. If the inspector catches a major deviation, they can stop production. I've been on jobs where they shut down welding, no welding, until we get this figured out. You guys don't have a clue as to what you're doing, shut it down, figure it out, and then come talk to us when you've got it figured out. Who's getting pulled into this thing? Well, everybody in the food chain. The foreman, superintendent, maybe the lead man, QA, welding engineers, they're all coming into these meetings. And whoever's on the client's team, the third-party inspector and whoever else they decide to bring in. And then we're going to have to write a non-conformance report to explain the mistake. And we're going to argue, negotiate, and try and prove that the incorrect filler metal won't destroy the entire project or whatever. If it's bad enough, we can start cutting out welds. And that's time, money, and pain. I've been involved in projects where we cut out a lot of welds because we didn't have our welding processes under control, and we didn't have control of which welders on second shift were making certain welds. So you went off the rails. Now what? Was it intentional or accidental? Doesn't matter. Consequences are real. We're going to have to deal with it. If you go rogue and weld outside the WPS, you're a big boy, big girl, big person. You're responsible. So if it's caught early, it's a headache. If it's caught late, it can be a disaster. It can be brutal. So if we can't justify the mistake, we're going to have to do a lot of rework and removal. And depending on the size of the welds and, do these things need heat treatment? How much NDE do they need? This stuff can get expensive in a hurry. And if you're the reason, you might get cut loose. Or you're going to end up welding on something that makes you wish you had run off. You're going to be welding on the staircases or something. Whatever. You don't get paid to make judgment calls. You get paid to follow that WPS. If it says stand on your head and weld while drinking a Diet Coke, that's what you do. Which leads us to the meetings, where we're in a rock fight, and what happens when this weld goes wrong. So you think the meetings are just discussions? No, these things are rock fights. You get into these with the client and their representation as far as their welding experts and engineers, and these things can get rough quick. They're brutal. You're not just fighting the customer a lot of times. You might be fighting your own QC and QA department. Why? Somebody welded with the wrong material, busted an x-ray too many times, or maybe we blew through the NDE budget. I was on a job where we didn't have our welding processes under control, and I think we blew through the NDE budget by like $1 million or something. I mean, it was insane. They sent a guy out from Central Control, and you couldn't shoot an x-ray on this job without him signing off on it. Now instead of welding, we're sitting in a conference room trying to explain what went wrong to the client. So who's in the hot seat in these? Well, if the welding mistake's big enough, here's who gets pulled into these meetings. The foreman. Hey, why wasn't this caught earlier? It's your guys. QA, QC. How'd this make it past inspection? What's going on? Are you guys doing your job? The welding engineer. How do we prove this won't cause failure? The welding engineer also gets roped in there with the foreman, because why weren't you out there on the job floor or out there walking around the job site? I thought you said you were keeping things under control. I thought you had this under control, and your people, the welders, were trained, and we weren't going to have these kind of issues. Do we have process control issues? The superintendent, well, he's got to answer to somebody at corporate because everything went off the rails, and it's costing him time and money. The customer representatives, they're saying, hey, why should we accept this work? How about you guys just cut out all those welds and redo it on your dime, and we get what we're looking for? Nobody wants to be in one of these meetings, and everybody's looking for a way out or somebody to blame. And these things can get ugly quick, especially if there's a lot of money on the line. So if you stay in the game long enough, you're going to end up in one of these meetings. Straight up truth. As a foreman, CWI, inspector, superintendent, you're going to end up in one of these. And sometimes you're the client and you're hammering on your vendor, asking, hey, what are you knuckleheads doing? Why are you guys doing it like this? I thought you had your welding processes under control. Sometimes you're on the receiving end of this. It can go either way. All right, so now we're going to have to write a non-conformance report. And what may a non-conformance report be, you ask? Well, what is it? It's an official document that explains what went wrong, wrong filler metal, incorrect weld process, bad fusion, whatever. What went wrong? We got to document it. We got to document why it happened. Was it a welder mistake? Was it a material mix-up? Did the guy in the rod room hand out the wrong material? Bad documentation. Did we give you the wrong WPS, the wrong work instructions? Was there a bad work packet? What went wrong? Then we got to put in there how we're going to fix it. Do we need to rework it, repair it, accept as is? What's going to go on? How are we going to prevent it from happening again? Training, new QC measures, better documentation. We got to tell the customer and client exactly how we're going to prevent this from ever happening again. And it's basically a confession letter explaining how we screwed up and promising it won't happen again. So why do we even bother with NCRs? Well, this is the business side of things. So why not just grind it out and move on? Well, here's why we don't do that. Liability protection. If the weld fails later, NCRs prove we addressed the issue. Cost tracking. Rework costs money, and the company needs to track every dollar. So we write NCRs to keep track of where that money's going, where and why and how. Legal and code compliance. AWS, ASME, API. A lot of these require, documentation of non-conformances, depending on what's going on and how your quality program is set up. You need to track this stuff. Customers lose trust. If we hide bad welds, we're going to lose contracts. We're going to go out of business. Nobody's going to want to do any work with us. Pretty simple. And every NCR is a battle. It's one that costs time, money, and reputation. So then you're like, what's that welding engineer doing? What's his job? Well, as the welding engineer, a lot of times I've had to be the defense lawyer. So if we're in hot water, the welding engineer is the guy standing between us and ultra disaster sometimes. So I'm there a lot of times as the defense lawyer, trying to get it. We're not getting off scot-free, but we're going to have to pay some penance. We're going to have to do something usually. We're not going to get them usually to take everything as is. We got to take responsibility. We're going to have to apologize, submit a corrective action report, and somebody's going to have to fall on the sword. And it's all part of the game. We have to justify the mistake. If we can prove that it won't cause failures, we might get away without cutting that weld out. If they push it hard enough, we're going to have to cut that weld out, and we're going to have to redo it. And if it's a big enough weld, it's going to be expensive. If it's got a wall thickness that's crazy thick, we're going to have to cut that weld out, re-prep everything, and start welding it up again. And then we have to write a NCR, the dreaded NCR. Best case, we convince them to accept the weld as is. Best case scenario. A lot of times that's not an option. Worst case, major rework. You want to see a superintendent or a job site superintendent, project manager lose their mind, start talking major rework on welding. Lost money and somebody's getting run off. It might be welders, foreman, superintendent, welding engineer. There's a chance that somebody's not coming back. So, takeaway, how to keep the bosses out of the meetings. Or if you're a foreman or a welding engineer or whoever, I guess this all applies to all of us, follow the rules. You want to avoid getting dragged into NCR meeting? Follow the rules. Follow the WPS to the letter of the law. No deviations. Follow that thing. Double check materials before striking an arc. Make sure what you're welding is what you're supposed to be welding. If something seems wrong, stop and escalate. Don't be afraid to stop and escalate. Talk to QC and QA early. Don't wait until it's already a mess. It's a lot easier to get this nipped in the bud at an early level than to, let it escalate further out and we got issues. Never assume it's good enough. The inspectors will find it. That's what they get paid to do. If they find it, it's going to be a world of hurt for everybody involved. So the takeaway, why you get paid the big bucks. This isn't a hobby. This is precision welding for critical applications. Nuclear, Navy, submarines, petrochemical, oil and gas going on the bottom of the ocean, whatever. Critical. You want to make the good money, follow the WPS. The WPS isn't just extra paperwork. It's what keeps the job running. And your paycheck coming. Once again, that's why you get the big bucks. If something doesn't look right, stop and escalate. Questions, comments, thoughts, concerns. Gary Pace, PE, Katy, Texas, TexasWeldingEngineering.com.